Welcome back to Exceptional History. In our last video, we found George Washington in the midst of a violent battle where Indian sharpshooters had taken aim and fired at him. Since his face is planted on the dollar bill, we're going to assume he made it, but today we're going to find out how. So, without further ado, let's find out the rest of George's story, because this is Exceptional History. As the battle raged on, the Indian sharpshooters had singled George out. They had already picked off Braddock's other senior officers, but despite shooting specifically at George multiple times, they could not bring him down. The fact that George survived the battle without a single scratch was eerie to them, so much so that 15 years later, in 1770, the same chief who had ordered George to be shot down said, "Our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle." This testimony was observed and related multiple times by Dr. James Craig, a close Washington family friend. George himself left little opinion on the matter. However, a more immediate witness to the event was Captain Robert Orme, an officer on Braddock's staff who reported, "Mr. Washington had 2 horses shot under him, and his clothes shot through in several places, behaving the whole time with the greatest courage and resolution." Whatever you choose to believe about these testimonies, one thing is a solid fact. As the Indian chief said, George was never injured in battle. As for Braddock's battle, it also became known as Braddock's Fall. Braddock was wounded through the side, and the English regulars were badgered into a retreat. Fortunately for them, the Indians and French found spoiling the battlefield more interesting than pursuing further quarry. Braddock was treated by the same Dr. James Craig and was witnessed to have said, "Who would have thought it?" He died the next day, and George was forced to bury him in the middle of the road to keep Indians from finding the body and desecrating it. He retreated with the remaining forces to a camp commanded by a man named Dunbar. Unfortunately, Dunbar was the epitome of a coward. Though he had superior forces, he pretended to have Braddock's dying words, which of course were to retreat as quickly as possible. In a letter meant to assure his mother of his safety, George ranted, "In short, the dastardly behavior of those they call regulars exposed all others that were inclined to do their duty to almost certain death." He then wrote a letter to his brother John, acknowledging his close call with death by saying, "But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." For the next 3 years, George spent his time defending families in the frontier. He recounted that he often had the displeasure of finding families that had been slaughtered or who had come starving to British forts for protection. Many times he expressed his frustrations at having a great desire to help his countrymen, but having no means to do so. Relief came for him when he was sent to Williamsburg on military business. While there, he was accosted with a bloody flux, which was also known as dysentery. It was so bad that his physicians warned him he would risk his life again if he didn't stop all activity. Heeding their advice, George resigned and returned to Mount Vernon in the January of 1759 to try again to become a gentleman farmer. George was just short of 27 when he resigned from the military, and at that age it was more than time for him to find a wife. He had all the usual trappings for this sort of endeavor. He was described as unusually tall for men of his era, straight, broad-shouldered, poised and dignified in his movements, and his military background didn't hurt things either. His only drawback was that he was a very frank person, which didn't mesh well with the usual flirtations that come with a courtship. In his younger years, he had different frustrating experiences with the opposite opposite sex, which created a fear of denial. However, necessity and age seemed to quell these apprehensions, as he was able to mesh rather well with a Martha Custis. The match was economical to an extent. Martha was a recent widow with a relatively large inheritance from her husband and a son and daughter to support. George was a financially stable landowner with a nice reputation to match. It was a brief courtship, but the two seemed to form an adequate emotional attachment. After the marriage, George wrote, "I am now, I believe, fixed at this seat with an agreeable consort for life, and I hope to find more happiness in retirement than I ever experienced amidst a wide and bustling world." When George's new family settled into Mount Vernon, he set about making home improvements that made his house a desired place for a number of guests. Though Mount Vernon had fallen into disrepair in his absence, his land holdings increased over the years, and his farm became successful. It was during this time that George discovered he loved being a farmer more than a military man, saying, "The life of a husbandman, of all others, is the most delectable." Now about this point you might be thinking, George had slaves on his farm. Aren't you going to say something about the morality of that? Yes, I am! In another video entitled Things I Didn't Have Room in This Video to Say About George Washington. So, let's keep moving. Besides working at being a farmer, George also worked at being a father to Martha's 4-year-old son Jack and 3-year-old daughter Patsy. Though Martha and George were unable to have children together, George welcomed her children as his own, and they took to calling him Papa. George took it upon himself to be attentive and generous to the children, often sending away for expensive toys. He considered his duty as their guardian more serious than the duty of a parent, since he was responsible to his conscience and not his paternal instincts. He thus worked to ensure that they had the best education. However, despite his attentions, George could not protect Patsy against the epileptic convulsions that began plaguing her at 12. This would have been exceptionally horrifying to the Washingtons, as they had no idea what was causing Patsy's painful convulsions, and the doctors could only describe her episodes as spells. In 1773, at 17, Patsy experienced a spell that she didn't awake from. She died in a short 2-minute period. Her death was, of course, devastating to George and Martha. On one hand, Martha was inconsolable, while George wrestled with what he believed to be a divine hand that had taken his child. He finally came to this conclusion: the ways of Providence being inscrutable, and the justice of it not to be scanned by the shallow eye of humanity, nor to be counteracted by the utmost efforts of human power or wisdom, resignation, and, as far as the strength of our reason and religion will carry us, a cheerful acquiescence to the divine will are what we aim for. During these years at Mount Vernon, George was not oblivious to the happenings in England. The high price and low quality of British imports compared to the low price and high quality of colonial exports did not escape his attention or the contents of his wallet. He also noticed that the British government, feeling the colonists should pay for the French and Indian War fought in their defense, levied a series of taxations. In order to understand the injustice of this, think of this as an enemy power attacking your state, the government defending you, and then demanding you pay for the defense, as if it wasn't their job to protect you in the first place. Add to this that you aren't allowed to send any representatives from your state to give your opinion on the matter. A little alienating, right? The colonists sensed this alienation and were incited at it. George heard their representatives protest while serving as a member at the House of Burgesses. He watched acts of taxation rise and fall under colonial boycotts. Still, though the colonials were enraged, at this point no one thought of independence from Britain. This was still a contest between citizens and monarch. A cat-and-mouse game ensued, colonists boycotting the taxations in some way, the monarch and British Parliament relinquishing and then coming up with another way to punish the colonists. It was no longer a government protecting its people, but chastising them for their own wounded pride. The final blow came when, in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, which basically put Massachusetts under martial law. That was too much for George. He offered to raise 1,000 men at his own expense, but the House of Burgesses was not ready for that. Potentially, peace could still be made with the mother country. However, George's proposition seemed more appealing when, after a day dedicated to prayer, the royal governor dissolved their legislative body. In response, the Burgesses urged the colonies to send representatives to form their own Congress, a Congress that would later be known as the Continental Congress. Sensing that this was the beginning of something, George wrote in his diary, "Went to church and fasted all day." George was later chosen as one of the Virginia delegates sent to the Special Congress in Williamsburg. Along with stars such as John Jay, John Adams, Patrick Henry, George joined the First Continental Congress. Acknowledging his narrow education, George wisely spent most of his time listening, examining, and absorbing the issues of the surrounding colonies and their politics. They were a splintered lot, bound by what George termed the cause. When George prepared to travel to the Second Continental Congress, shots between colonists and British soldiers at Concord drove war into the air. As George entered the Continental Congress in May, he wore his uniform from the French and Indian War, personifying the colonial tilt toward war. By June, spats between British regulars and colonial militia made war inevitable. Many eyes looked toward George as a potential commander-in-chief for the American Army. He was the closest thing they had to an experienced military leader. But though he had experience, it is debatable whether it was up to par to lead a fractured, undisciplined colonial force against the largest military power in the world. George's reluctance for the job is evidenced in the way he rushed out of the room when he realized he was about to be chosen for the job. When he did accept the position, he said, "I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command." Indeed, he felt that he had embarked on a wide ocean with boundless prospect. His honor or dishonor weighed in the balance. Defeat meant he would be judged as a traitor. Victory left his country on unexplored shores. He could not see what we know as America today, but he could see the bared teeth of the most powerful military in the world racing toward his countrymen. His only grounding was a firm belief in the justice of our cause, a cause that, as he put it, had to be supplemented with integrity to make up for his lack of experience. In this way, George threw his and his family's future to the wind, and to that divine hand he was fond of mentioning. I hope you liked that video. If you did, you know the drill. Please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and leave us a comment to let us know if you liked this, if you didn't like it, what you thought about it, and we will see you in our next video.